What's going on, Clarence? Cornmeal. Let's do it. D-man alright. Whoa. D-man alright. Spicy mafia. Spicy mafia. You gotta keep it spicy. If you see a queen, you better wife it. While we litter than a lighter, it makes things much brighter.
Okay, so I've got, for a second time, and we're pretty honored to have him, Jonald Fyookball, who, of course, is a prominent developer in the Bitcoin Cash community, and he's very well known as being a thought leader, having skin in the game with projects like Electron Cash Wallet, which I personally use, Cash Shuffle, Cash Fusion. His Medium posts are mandatory reading for the Bitcoin Cash community. He's cited by everybody. He's one of these elder statesmen in terms of experience in Bitcoin Cash that we often look to for sobriety, someone that can kind of guide how we're to think about things. And so that's a long way to get to his essay called On Bitcoin Governance, Achieving Our Goals, Preventing Protocol Capture, and Avoiding Community Splits. But before we get headlong into that, thanks so much, Jonald, for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
And so let me kind of ask right away, because you published this about a week ago or so. What I guess prompted you? Like, why now? Why write this now?
Yeah, so it was really just like a lot of ideas that just kind of like happened to click for me. I'm just thinking about all the issues that we've been facing and are facing in our community. And so it's interesting because, I mean, I've sort of been working almost full time on Bitcoin Cash since, for 2 years since it started.
Right.
And it's only now that things are just really starting to crystallize, at least for me. So I can imagine that other people that aren't working as closely with Bitcoin Cash or maybe just on the fringes or whatever, aren't even aware of some of these things. Yeah, just having the experience, all of us as a community, having the experience of looking back 2 years and what our ideas were specifically about, let's say multiple implementations, and we had a certain idea of how that would look like, and then now, we have the experience of looking a couple years down the road. We can look back and say, well, this idea sounds good in theory, but that's not really what's happening, or maybe this other idea we thought was a good idea, but now we can see these other issues with it. And I think there's some problems that we need to address within our community as far as our culture. Like that the hash war with BSV was a very painful lesson as far as,
and we're coming up on a year from that almost exactly. Wow. Right?
Yeah. So I feel like we should be learning the lessons. Like, why did the hash war happen, or not why did it happen, but why was it so damaging? And it's like the answer is that we weren't really a united community. So we had this end-chain group that wanted to basically control the protocol. Bitcoin ABC and Bitcoin BU, the two other main implementations, were not able to really be a united front. And so it was kind of the classic divide and conquer tactics that we allowed ourselves to fall prey to. And I'm hoping that we can learn that lesson and just have a bigger, greater awareness of what's actually going on within our community and the dynamics between different groups, and hopefully we can avoid those issues. And like the title of the article says, we want to achieve our goals, which is building peer-to-peer electronic cash. We want to prevent the protocol from being captured by, whether that's from an end chain or a block stream or whoever. And then we also want to avoid a community split. It's like not an easy thing to solve, but we need to move forward as a community and grow. And we want to think about these problems before they become, too big to solve, right?
Yeah, and I noticed there's lots of really compelling parts to it that instantly sort of jump out when you read your piece here. And you alluded to it just now with regard to developer capture, which I want you to flesh out a bit, but also you give some props to the Bitcoin Core approach in terms of upgrades. Can you talk a little bit about both and how they're related, developer capture and the core approach?
Yeah, so like I was saying in the article, when the Bitcoin Cash community got started, we had just forked away from BTC, right? So we looked and said, oh, what happened there? There was this one group, and they, Blockstream was paying for the salaries of these core developers, and they just decided they're going to do this plan, which is not really, not what we would consider peer-to-peer electronic cash, not on a global scale. So we had looked at that and then saw that, oh, well, it was because there was this one centralized group, so we need quote unquote decentralized development. And, we had these different implementations, and we kind of, we're a young, naive community and kind of thought, oh, well, that kind of solves the problem. Case closed, right? But
yeah, for sure.
We know that it's not that simple now, right? And so, as far as like what's good about the BTC approach, so they kind of used they kind of went to the extreme, like, and said, okay, no hard forks. We can't do anything without extreme consensus. And so that was a really bad approach when we had a 1 megabyte block limit. It was a very clear obstacle, right? That we needed to get over that. But that being said, there is a value in not making protocol upgrades, and that you kind of like you remain on the existing consensus rules, which is a strong selling point. So the idea that, and I'm kind of quoting the Bitcoin maximalist here, but the idea that Bitcoin is hard to change is actually a good thing. Now we have to balance that with the engineering work to optimize the software, and we can't really do that right now and say we're not going to make any protocol changes. But it's like a good principle, and hopefully, like if you look at the Bitcoin Cash roadmap, there is a thing on the end that says protocol complete. So if we do the things and we kind of prove to ourselves that we have done the engineering work to allow global scale, at that point it may be good to freeze the protocol and have like a stronger kind of a set in stone model at that point.
And the developer capture aspect, I guess instantly the retort to that would be, well, geez, so let's just let miners decide everything. They're thought to, in many circles, to secure the network. Why don't we just go down that route and just let, kind of take developers out of it almost completely under the rubric of the capture worry, and just hand Bitcoin Cash over to miners? Why not just do that?
Well, miners are always like kind of in control. They kind of have the final say. But so what the reality looks like is that the miners want to have a group of trusted developers that put out reliable software that they all can agree running. And so this is what happened with both with BTC and in BCH. This was one of the reasons why it was so hard to get bigger blocks in BTC, because all the miners were just running Core, and they liked Core. It was reliable. They didn't want to rock the boat. And there is some truth to, we want to have really good, solid, reliable code. I feel like not all of the core talking points are like completely crazy, right? It's just like they kind of took them to the extreme and stuff, and it's just like, but yeah, there is some truth to that as well. Like we want solid, reliable code. And when I say we, it's not really what we the users want. It's what the miners seem to want. So with BTC, they stuck with Core. They're still with Core, and then in BCH, everyone's running ABC because that's kind of they're happy with that program. They don't necessarily want to micromanage that. And also, there's kind of an interesting interplay between like the users / community, like people like us, and the developers, the protocol developers. We're kind of forming our own consensus. We're kind of, the users and the developers are kind of having a loose consensus on what the protocol rules should be, and the miners are just running that. Because if the miners were just to decide on their own without kind of consulting what the users want, then that isn't a good path, because they may not be as well informed as the users are.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting one, especially the notion that there's some wisdom in core, because sort of unstated, the underlying assumption for, geez, I want to say at least the last 2 years has been, everything that comes out of them is necessarily evil. And so it's nice to see the maturation of thinking in the Bitcoin Cash community, that maybe not everything there was so awful. So that's encouraging. I'm wondering, because a lot of people say, well, the reason that we should latch on to ABC, besides maybe its technical superiority, and that's for other people to decide. And CoinSpice podcast is listened to by investors, mining community, developers. They all kind of listen to kind of get the zeitgeist of Bitcoin Cash. What I'm sort of thinking now is that when I read your article, which this is not the point of it, but I wanted to ask about it. It seems like Bitcoin ABC is sort of there because the exchanges have absorbed it, and it would be almost impossible. Okay, that's maybe not right, but it would be very difficult to dislodge ABC because the exchanges and payments platforms defer to it. Is there a danger in, I guess, succumbing to or allowing so much power to exchanges?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So yeah, I guess it ties into one of the themes of the article, and that's like, do we want to have a lead implementation, or some people call it a reference implementation,
Yeah,
or not? So when we first kind of started Bitcoin Cash, the ethos was very much like, let's make it as decentralized as we can. But in practice, like, I think a lot of people were upset because they expected there would be this kind of sharing of the power, right? Or sharing of leading protocol development. And in practice, it's really been, let's call it the ABC show, pejoratively. But I think the article is making the point that it's not necessarily a bad thing. So if you're talking about capture resistance, like, we don't want another block stream, is ABC just turning into another core? So there, that is a valid concern. First of all, if you look at the history, things were centralized at first under Gavin, or before that Satoshi, and then Gavin.
right.
And the project was still going in the right direction. And then when others came in, okay, it was more decentralized, but then that's where things like kind of fell apart. And then we had the same thing with, when we first forked off from BTC, it was ABC, it was great. And then we had all these other implementations, and then it was really the three big implementations, ABC, BU, and Nchain, and we kind of fell apart there. So it's not necessarily, and I don't want to repeat all the little points in the article, but
Right.
yeah, it's basically, it's not really necessarily a bad thing that there's a lead implementation. And the other model, which is like the multiple implementations with no lead, has its own attack vectors. So there is no like perfect solution. There's no easy solution to this. Overall, I'd say like I'm much less concerned than I would have been 2 years ago, because I understand the dynamics better.
Yeah, I'm sensing that there's a real epiphany happening with you and some others in this regard. And you do two things to piggyback off of what we just talked about. One is that you sort of lay out the empirical case that, look, guys, forks are definitely freedom, and obviously Bitcoin Cash wouldn't exist without them, but they also come in terms of a split, contentious hard forks, with a real cost to both those who wanted to stay as one, and those who wanted to break off, and that the parts usually do not equate to the sum of the whole, and they actually wind up hurting each other in kind of a weird Mexican standoff way. And then without the sort of leadership idea, or this sort of decentralized, almost utopian way that we looked at the world 2 years ago, in a sense, you sort of passed by it, but I thought it was really interesting. You call that a kind of tragedy of the commons, right?
Right. So yeah, I mean, the Mexican standoff is kind of a good way to put it. Like the guy with the least to lose is going to shoot first, right? So it's a tragedy of the commons because the other implementations, other than the lead, let's just call them alternative implementations, there's kind of a natural incentive there for them to want to either at some point become the lead implementation or to, maybe do things to just kind of put their stuff out there. So it depends on it depends on the motivations of the people in those implementations. And so not everyone is everyone's different. Some people are they just want to contribute and just make Bitcoin Cash great. And some people are more kind of about themselves. Like they want to, they want their code to be seen and stuff like that. But that sets up it sets up these weird incentives. But I agree with what you were saying, about just the issues, with the hash war, really we're too small to be, if we were the majority chain, it might be different. We could kind of compete more fiercely and it'd be great. But there's we're competing with Dash and Ethereum and all these other coins, right? So we want to be a united front.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I can already hear some of the objections as people are listening. But it gets into what really you're talking about ultimately here is culture, and your sort of watch phrase, your sort of guidepost is permissionless peer-to-peer cash at global scale, which is kind of the heart of the Bitcoin Cash roadmap going forward. And what on the culture side, this is something that quite a few people seized on, and I'm going to quote you back to yourself here and ask you to expand a little bit on it. Truly benevolent dictators do not seek control for control's sake, and instead attempt to foster a culture of inclusiveness and collaboration, because that is in the best interests of the coin. But it's not always beneficial to include everyone, particularly those that demonstrate power-seeking behavior. Can you flesh that out a little bit with regard to culture and not always including everyone?
The first thing you said about the cash or peer-to-peer cash, I think part of the problem with in the BTC era was the core developers just decided at some point they wanted to build something else other than peer-to-peer cash, and so there was a lot of this debate. And it was kind of like a red herring, they would say, well, it's not decentralized enough, but then they ended up sacrificing the key properties of what Bitcoin is, or what we believed it should be, in order to have people run nodes on a Raspberry Pi and et cetera. So having the end goal and just having that as a shelling point is powerful, because it's if that is deeply embedded in the culture, there's only so much we can get off track as far as what we're actually building. And that's not the only consideration, but it's okay, at least if we all agree on building peer-to-peer cash, that's that's a good starting point, right? And so I say permissionless just to make a distinction between other things. I don't consider the Lightning Network permissionless. I mean, it's by definition permission,
right,
in terms of opening channels and stuff. I don't agree with the minor ID stuff some people have been talking about in the past. I think the BSV people like that idea. So it's it has to be permissionless peer-to-peer cash, meaning I can send money to anyone at any time, right? And then at global scale, meaning okay, you could argue that BTC is peer-to-peer cash, but if it only serves 400,000 transactions a day, it's not really cutting the cake, right? Or cutting the mustard, right? So
yeah, those are all, I mean, that to me, what that does is it focuses the community upon it kind of gives a filter. So if we evaluate a project, an implementation, some new idea, fancy new application, it has to kind of go through this filter. And does it in any way distract from this? And I'm not saying it's going to be a cure-all and an exact science, but it certainly helps direct the conversation into more productive ways. But you've said it a couple times now, and I always forget to ask, especially when Anne-Marie talks about them. And you said shelling points. What's a shelling point, and how does it factor into what you're talking about in terms of Bitcoin Cash culture?
It kind of goes back to what Bitcoin is. It's a distributed consensus system, right? So we all have to be running the same set of consensus rules. when we want to, like I was saying earlier, if there's no upgrades to the rules, it's very simple. We just all just keep running the same rules forever. But when we're talking about changing those rules, we have to move from one Schelling point to another. So if you're not familiar with what a Schelling point is, it's kind of something in game theory where it's kind of like a central location or a central thing where everyone would be kind of just like drawn to converge onto. So an example is two people are in Paris and they don't know where each of the other is, but they have to meet up. Where are they going to meet up? Probably at the Eiffel Tower, right? Or something like that, or the Louvre or something.
Gotcha.
So it's like this obvious kind of spot where it's kind of like a magnet where everyone is just naturally drawn. It's the same thing in crypto with like, BTC is like it has the most network effect, right? At least in terms of like price. Schelling points, the lead implementation is a Schelling point. So Bitcoin ABC, the fact that all the exchanges are running ABC, you can look at the negative of that as somewhat centralized, but there's the positive side of that is that it makes it very simple. It avoids splitting the chain, and it just helps us all. As long as ABC is not doing something obviously bad, we're just going to keep using the updates from ABC, and we're going to just follow them as long as they're leading us down the right path. At least that's how I see this model. Now I know that some people don't like that, right? If they don't like the people in ABC or they don't, whatever. There's definitely something to be said for having Schelling points.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you talk about it as in your conclusion, in your essay here on Bitcoin governance, and you talk about that shared vision in terms of the desired outcome. But one of the other points you make here in terms of the solution part of it is because I think a lot of people who listen may be triggered a little bit by this idea of perhaps censorship, and it's the first thing that you try to address when you talk about solutions and going forward and how to create this culture that you're talking that you're trying to cultivate, I guess. Why is censorship-free communication, in light of all that you've just said, still important? It would seem to me that maybe like you're giving voice in a weird way to censorship. Like, okay, we need to cut these people out, but you went to great pains here at the end to go, no. Censorship is dangerous. So kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So in this current reality, in this model that I call multiple implementations with the lead implementation, I think it's good to support the lead implementation and follow them. Basically follow them until they do something obviously bad. And that's even more true for a minority chain. So even if they were acting kind of bad, I would still say it's probably, we should just follow them because otherwise we're just going to end up with another hash war. But that being said, there has to be a mechanism for, if they are acting bad, right? We do need to, we can't tolerate that, forever. So there has to be some recourse, some mechanism where we can say, hey, this lead implementation that we've been following for X number of years or whatever is not serving us anymore. And that's what should have happened with Bitcoin Core, right? They were our heroes from 2010 to 2015 or so, and it was because of the censorship that we couldn't even like challenge them, right? So there needs to be that freedom to, freedom of speech, let's say, to examine what's going on and ask the question, hey, is this lead implementation serving us? Are they delivering on moving us down the road to our goal of peer-to-peer cash? And it's interesting because I think like a lot of the drama and stuff is kind of like taking side jabs and not really, like no one's really coming out and saying, like making a Reddit post and saying, hey, I think ABC is not leading us to peer-to-peer cash and we should replace them. They're just kind of like taking these little trollish kind of stabs here and there, and it's just
death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah, and I don't really agree with that approach necessarily. So I feel like, okay, if you don't like ABC, then like out with the problem. What are they doing that's not leading us down the roadmap to the promised land? And if they're not doing something bad, then let's support them. And instead, we've got this kind of like the crux of the problem is the community condones the infighting because they think it's good for decentralization. But I don't necessarily agree. I think that's kind of one of my personal revelations in all this.
It is really, really fascinating because you've definitely gone to the heart of many of my assumptions. So it's a brilliant essay, formulated very, very well. It's not an attack piece. It's not an accusation piece. It's someone who knows the space well, who's got skin in the game, who's well respected, really all over the Bitcoin Cash community, and he's trying to sort of lay out where we are if you're a Bitcoin Cash supporter and where it needs to go. And the last part before I let you go is, to me, on the media side of things, arguably the most important part, which is an educated community. And it goes to the censorship issue. It goes to everything that we do at CoinSpice, and why we've really embraced developer culture. And we've got a developer digest. We have developers on all the time. We're constantly talking about the engineering, the technology, because we feel it's such an important part of being an educated investor, community member, and an advocate. How does a more educated community then factor into what you're talking about here?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really the community that needs to have like the mind share or whatever. Like part of the issue with the BTC split was just like people not really understanding like what is this block size limit? What is that? What does that even mean, right? So you had a lot of like just technically uneducated people just not understanding what's going on, and that's like the greatest weapon against against tyranny is like a well-educated populace, right?
Yeah.
And but it's not just the education about Bitcoin. It's also like education about the issues and where people stand and what they're really saying. Like, and it's hard to really pierce the veil sometimes. So just to give an example, like this recent drama with this 25 transaction limit, it's kind of a good example of what I'm talking about here. Ideally, we're collaborating, right? Like, so people wanted this 25 transaction limit, and then BU came out with a solution, and then so now it's like what's going on is ABC going to implement that solution or whatever. So I'll just give you a few of my points about this, and I need to call things the way they are, but I also don't want to stir the pot too much. But basically, so ABC has asked for us, a spec, so they can, and I also asked for a spec. Are we going to get a spec? And basically, specs are one way we can help each other collaborate, and they also help non-technical people. So going back to the community, like most of the community is not going to get in the code, right, and look at the actual code. So the
Right.
next best thing is the spec. So it really helps to see like what is going on. And I guess Peter Risen says that he doesn't think that we need a spec. So this is like part of like getting into the issues. I don't want to I don't want this to be seen as like an attack on Peter Risen, because I like Peter, and he's been like one of the founders of the big block movement, and so someone that I definitely
For sure.
look up to. But basically, he's saying, if you read his comments in the thread about this, he's saying we don't need a spec, and it's because it's not consensus. He's kind of okay. I don't want to put words in his mouth or whatever, but just my take on it is like it's kind of okay to break zero conf. Basically, what that means is like just the reliability of when you send a transaction. And so there's this like trade-off between. So he makes a really good point. There's a trade-off between like permissionless innovation and just trying to make everything harmonized. And I guess what he's saying is that it's okay if we break it a little bit, because then we'll fix it over here with some double spend proofs and stuff like that. But I'm not convinced that that's really necessarily the right approach. It's just, I don't know. I'm not sure, like what I've read about the issue, like there's actually a really good video with Vin Armani and Shema Chancellor, where Shema is talking about some of the details of this stuff and how, the fee computations are done, currently at the block template construction, the block template construction level. I mean, I don't know all the details, but it's like, it sounds like we need to like change how the information flows from like transaction emission to mempool to block template. And we have to like rip out certain code and like basically put a lot of modifications to mempool block template and and the transaction admission. And it's like, so from ABC's point of view, this is like really complicated. And then BU and Peter are saying, well, it's all the complication is due to like this child pays for parent stuff. But I'm not sure that's like really true because actually Greg Maxwell made an interesting comment about it. You know, all these technical details get really deep, but it's like without a spec, how are we supposed to know? So look, I'm all for permissionless innovation, and like, you know, BU can do whatever they want, but I don't think it's like necessarily collaborative. There's like, well, I'm glad Bitcoin.com is not like rushing to like push this out and break ZeroConf. And so I'm just hoping we can all kind of get on the same page. But basically, ABC has been saying like, hey, we're not opposed to fixing this, but we want, you know, who's going to pay for this? Because right now they just have one part-time developer who's working on that. And so if we want to speed that up, we should get more funds into ABC. I don't see like what's wrong about, you know, supporting the lead implementation, but not everyone sees it that way. But I guess I'm more on the side of ABC as far as like, I think we should get into ABC. We should have a spec. We should get the funding for them to get it in. And there's a lot of people that are just fanning the flames of the controversy, and I don't think that's good. So
in educating the community now, because from the outside, you know, how much time people have, you know, sort of the average person to dedicate to this minutia, is that we'll hear something like there's a bounty offered to raise a transaction limit that at first glance seems kind of arbitrary, a little too conservative, and sort of the ethos, the unstated ethos of Bitcoin Cash is go capitalism, move fast, break things. And here we have this 25 transaction limit, and it's preventing at least one business from expanding, and so they're offering a bounty to do that.
Let me just interject, because I think you just nailed it. So when you said move fast, break things, like that's what BU is saying we should do, and that's not what ABC is saying we should do. So that's part of the mentality. And so like, yeah, I think that's part of the controversy. Like
and it's harder for your point to get out there, which is, you know, look, I'm not against, like, there's nothing sacred. I didn't like open, you know, the Bible to Leviticus and it said, thou shalt not go above 25. There's nothing in principle against this idea. It's just that how is it going to work in relation to ZeroConf and other things? And so it's much easier for a bomb thrower to come, you're all a bunch of socialists and you're dictators and you want a developer kings and you're just like Core. And Jonald Fyookball is really Greg Maxwell, but with a better tailor. And I don't know, you know, it's harder. It's harder for you to go, okay, whoa, slow down, slow. Let's raise it to 6 trillion, you know, transactions. Your point is, getting from A to B. There is a kind of a workflow process rather that maybe people who are not developers really aren't familiar with. Tradition, if you will, is to issue a spec, to have, you know, people weigh in and test things and run it back and forward. And it seems like there's one implementation that's like, look, you know, we got this, and, you know, the market will decide. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. You're saying you're just trying to say, look, in the context of where Bitcoin Cash is this the hill we want to die on? You know, are people maybe taking this issue and running with it, right? And so education, looking at it soberly, looking at the sort of the bigger picture, would save a lot of these sort of headaches.
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't reviewed the actual code from BU's solution, but it sounds like at least a few people think that it's kind of a quick and dirty solution. And, you know, Peter Risen is saying, well, that's not true. It's all because ABC has the child pay for parent. So just to give some context, BU's code base was forked from Core before they put in child pays for parent. Which, right. So child pays for parent means if you have a transaction that's stuck with too low of a fee, you can then send one of the outputs of that, which is the child, and put a larger fee on that, and it will be kind of like summed together with the parent transaction and then accepted. So ABC's code base is newer and has that feature. And so number one, I'm not really entirely convinced that it's only because of child space for parent. It sounds like there's some quadratic issues in there that need a deeper look. Also, it's not like we can just remove child space for parent. It's actually a good feature. Like if the blocks ever became full, like with, let's say, a spam attack, right? And you had your transaction stuck, there should be a way for you to get it unstuck, right? So again, it just kind of goes back to this trade-off and these different opinions. Yeah, just to be clear, I'm not for breaking zero conf. I'm for let's do the change responsibly. And also just to give like some little bit of context on the resource thing, it's like I really wanted this not to be an issue. I was asking Omri, can we just code this up? Can we maybe let's get Mark Lunderberg on it because he's a superstar coder and he's helping me code with Fusion. And then Omri is saying, well, we need Mark to do the SIGOPS thing. So it's like, what is he going to do it after the SIGOPS thing? So there's this unrealistic kind of sense about what it's actually going to take to fix it properly. And I'm not saying this is for sure that I've looked at the code and everything, but that's basically what Team ABC is saying is, hey, this is not a trivial problem. At least show us a spec so we can kind of see if this makes sense.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion, and I think a lot of people will benefit by reading the Medium post here by Jonald Fyookball. It is on Bitcoin governance, achieving our goals, preventing protocol capture, and avoiding community splits. We'll have a link to it in the show notes here for the podcast episode. John, thanks so much, man, for coming on, for taking, he's doing this on a Saturday. He's got a life. He's got other things he wants to do, but he set aside this time for us to talk about this huge, very important issue about culture going forward. And I really think that this essay is going to shed a lot of light. So, man, thanks so much for all you do.
And I just want to say,
go right ahead.
All this stuff is it's not. I don't enjoy politics. I wish everyone could be friends. I don't like attacking people. I don't like saying bad things about people. I don't like saying bad things about groups. But this is all coming from a place of passion for Bitcoin Cash, and I don't want to see us in a bad place in another hash war, in another rift or split of the community. So my intention is to get everyone on the same page, get the facts out, and let's work together and build peer-to-peer cash for the world.
Gotta keep it spicy. Gotta keep it spicy. Gotta keep it spicy.